Good evening. Welcome to our shir on Pareshat Yitro. Hope you are well, and I thank you all for joining. We have several sponsors for this shir, so we're going to go here in order. Number one, the shir is sponsored by Eva Perez. It's to commemorate the yahrzeit of her mother, Magda Perezlansky, Miriam Bat Eliezer Yisrael. Yahrzeit was today. Neshama Shav and Aliyah. We thank you, Eva, very much for sponsoring, and the Neshama indeed should benefit from our words of Torah. Thank you so much to Lisa and Ken Kantarovitz. It's to commemorate the yahrzeit of their fathers, Lisa's father, Larry Nathanson, Yehuda Leib, Ben, Yehoshua and Fega Rivka, as a chronoli vracha, and Ken's father, Moshe Kantarovitz, Moshe Natan Aaron, Ben, Yitzchak, and Esther. Chof Gimel Shvat is the yahrzeit for both. And thank you so much, Ken and Lisa, for sponsoring Neshama Shalav and Aliyah. Thank you as well to Harriet Brown, who's commemorate the yahrzeit of her sister Marlene and Katzman, Malka Chana Bat Yaakov Ita, and it's today's the yahrzeit Neshama Shalav and Aliyah. Thank you to Andrea Stern and Isaac Singer, who are sponsoring to commemorate the yahrzeit of Andrea's mother, Esther Lillian Stern, Esther Laika Bat Yoel Vidvora. Yahrzeit was today. Neshama Shalav and Aliyah. Dan Weisblatt to commemorate the yahrzeit of her father Shmuel Hirsch Ben Yoav. Neshama Shalav and Aliyah. Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you so much, Andrea and Isaac. Thank you, Harriet. Thank you, Lisa and Ken. Thank you, Eva. And Neshama should benefit from our words of Torah that we're going to study here today. A big, significant parsha, Kabbalah Satorah. Right, we're going to hear the Aseres Hadibros. We do not like translating Aseres Hadibros as the 10 commandments because there are 613 commandments. And there was a time the Talmud shares with us that there were communities that had a desire to insert into their daily service the reading, a communal reading every single day, of Aseret HaDibrot, of the 10 sayings, indicating the desire, indicates that these are indeed very significant verses, and it is a very significant portion of the Torah. But the rabbi said, don't do it. Don't have a public reading of this section daily. We are concerned that there are people that would preach to the masses that only this section is significant. In other words, if we emphasize too much on the section of Aseret HaDibrot, someone might walk away with the wrong impression that this is the only part of Torah that is relevant, that's applicable. And this was a concern, and therefore the rabbi said, yes, it's important, no question about it, but please, don't elevate it to such an extent. And as a result, Rambam, Maimonides, was of the opinion that it is not appropriate for those who sit throughout the year for the Kriyat Torah, for the Torah reading. It is not appropriate to stand only for the Aseret HaDibrot. Maimonides saw it as problematic. Why? Don't show that only this portion is the significant one. As you know, the Minhag Yisrael is the custom is yes to stand. Ramosha Feinstein explains that, you know what, there is significance. And the concern that existed perhaps 2,000 years ago of specific sects that would perhaps preach that only this is important is no longer a threat. Some have a tradition of trying to stand from the beginning of the Aliyah. Bottom line is, it is a significant section of Torah because it describes a significant event when our ancestors 3,400 years ago stood by Mount Sinai, heard something and understood something and appreciated something that we live by today. So it's an incredible experience and an incredible section. Now, the Parsha itself is a Parsha that has two main sections. One of them, the first part of the Parsha, relates to the journey of Yisro. It's going to be the main discussion today. Yisro's journey. Moshe's father-in-law joins the nation at Mount Sinai. It is unclear if he joins them right before or right after. In other words, even though the order of things, as they are spelled out in the Torah, seem to indicate that Yisro arrived before the events of the revelation of Kabbalat Torah. Many commentators are not comfortable with it because they look at the activities of Moshe and he's interacting with the people and he's teaching the law. Those are things that take place mainly after Kabbalat Torah. So there's a major dispute among authorities, and it dates back to Talmudic times. When did Yitro arrive? That is the first part of the parsha, which we're going to address soon. The second part of the parsha has to do with the preparation for the revelation, and the revelation itself, the Aseret HaDibrot. And there were some important teachings we've talked about over the years. For example, there is a verse that appears in chapter 19, it is verse 13, where the Almighty tells Moshe Rabbeinu to warn the nation to keep away from the mountain during the event, and a hand shall not touch it. This is a holy location now. Lo tiga bo yad, it should not be touched. Fine, makes sense. Something holy is happening there. We keep away, no problem, nothing surprising there. But the second half of the verse is, Bimshoch hayovel, you should know, eventually the great events and the tremendous appearance that takes place there will come to an end. When it comes to an end, that which will symbolize an end is the blast of the Yofel, the blast of the shofar, signifying and indicating to us that the blast of a shofar is symbolically the end of the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And obviously this is linked in our mind to Yom Kippurim. And the Torah tells us, Bimshoch hayovel, when they hear the blast of the shofar, then Hema Ya'alu Bahar, then they shall ascend, then the nation should ascend the mountain. So if you're standing there around Mount Sinai, and there are a few children that have a deep desire to climb the mountain, or if it was snowing, they want to take their sleds and go down the mountain. You warn them not to, as long as the revelation, the event is taking place. When it comes to an end and they hear the big blast of the shofar, the Torah tells us, Hema Ya'alu Bahar. They could go up. Now, although that's the translation, they may ascend the mountain. If you read it carefully, it is not just they may, but Hema Ya'alu Bahar. It is as if the Torah is encouraging to go ahead, make your way to the mountain. And commentators point out that in Judaism, we have a little bit of an issue when we take a terrain and make it holy, because holiness is always the result of what people do. Okay, so I'll give you an example. We all know that a Jewish wedding is a tremendous celebration, and I don't just mean that there's a lot of good food and it's a place to interact with other people. The idea is, if you think about it, this is a celebration that has to do with continuity. A next generation is getting married. It's something that we celebrate, no question. Now, the big event at a wedding, the dancing is nice, the food might be nice as well, but the big event is actually the chuppah. We all know it, the chuppah. You come for the chuppah. You sit there, you perhaps meditate for a few seconds that this is an important event. Now, when under the chuppah, a couple gets together and comes together and becomes one unit, they walk in as two separate units and they walk away as a married couple. Something very holy is taking place there. No question, there are blessings being said, several blessings. They are said and they indicate the significance. And it is not far-fetched for us believing Jews that there's a presence of the Shekhinah there as the event is taking place under the chuppah. Now, I've seen recently, I was watching, there was someone that I know that had a wedding, we couldn't make it. We were participating a little bit over Zoom. So I wasn't watching too much, but one thing I did notice, that a good 15 minutes after the chuppah, there were some women praying under the chuppah. In other words, they were perhaps saying Tehillim, or they were davening Mincha or Ma'ariv, and they chose a location under the chuppah. And at first, I wondered why they don't have anywhere else. In other words, it's a large hall. There are other locations you could choose to go ahead and have your davening. But then it hit me that most probably these people who decided to daven under the chuppah, and again, the room is empty already because the Jewish people are eating. They're busy with their food. I'm sure that they were not expecting anyone to notice. It happened to be that the person who was carrying the camera around filming the hall happened to pass by it and it was noticeable. So I believe that they most probably have either heard from someone or have seen someone praying under the chuppah with an understanding or with a belief that this was a location where the Shekhinah was there. So therefore, they want to as if tap in to the presence of the Creator that still carries, there's some residual Shekhinah at that location. Okay, that is perhaps what they are trying to tap into. And what I would say to them is that in general in Judaism, locations do not become important on their own. There is no benefit in having a tour to Mount Sinai. You know why? There's nothing left. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, Bimshoch Hayavel, I'm going to blast the shofar, and this location, which just experienced the most important event for humanity, is going to have no sanctity at all. And do you know why the Almighty wants us to be mindful of the fact that sanctity does not carry on? In Judaism, don't make location significant, make the human experience significant. Okay, now, so what makes a synagogue important? You know why a shul is important? Because we turn to the Creator there. Why is the Temple Mount important? Because it is still a location where we turn to Him. It's a Shara Shamayim. Prayers are carried through that location to heaven. So currently, there's sanctity on the Temple Mount. Currently, there's sanctity by the Kotel. Currently, there's sanctity in every synagogue because humans, the Jewish people, are utilizing it. If there's a location that once upon a time there was a presence of God, Hashem wants that it should cease to make the people realize that, you know what, our religion is not one that enshrines locations of history. In other words, history, we all enjoy studying history. We enjoy Jewish history. We enjoy appreciating how specific practices developed. But you know, there's a little bit of a danger in studying history. If I sit down and study the history of the people of Israel, I'm an expert of different locations and different places the nation traveled, and I start believing that the Jewish experience is something of the past, it's enshrined, that's dangerous history. Because I must realize that the importance is what I achieve today. What I achieve today, what I do with myself today, right? If I make the right decisions, that is what's important in Judaism. And therefore, the sanctity of the location should cease. And as they walk by, and as they leave Mount Sinai, and they see their children playing a soccer game on the mountain, and they say to themselves, that place has no longer sanctity. So where is the sanctity, right? We just experienced revelation there. You know where the sanctity is? In our hearts, in our mind, and in our actions. When a Jewish person is tempted and they're able to overcome temptation, when someone agitates them and they control themselves, when they have difficulty performing a mitzvah, but they do it anyway, that is where the sanctity is not on a mountain, right? Lo b'shamayim, Torah always talks about the fact that it's not somewhere far away where you achieve things. It is in the moment you exist, in a moment of challenge, in a moment where there's uncertainty, when there's a moment that we don't know exactly what's waiting for us and we're afraid about God, if I make the right decisions right now, welcome to your Mount Sinai moment. It's not a geographical one. It is one you are present in. So this is one of the messages that we focus on. I want to get to the beginning of the Pareshat Yitro, and there's something very specific I want to address. Now, let's take three events that are presented in the Torah in sequence. Number one, the war of Amalek against the people of Israel. And let's not realize how significant it was. You have a nation that's weak, Ayef Yagea, a nation of slaves. They don't know how to fight for themselves. They don't have an identity. There's weakness there, don't have security, they don't have a homeland. And what happens? They are attacked by this nation that for some reason hates the Jewish people. They just hate us. They hate us. A nation that ignores all the flaws of humanity and points at the Jewish people and say they are flawed. Amalek, the first anti-Semites. They attack the Jewish people. Vayavo Amalek, vaylachem Israel. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to remember this event. You know what, Jewish people, the people of Israel, I'm telling you, record this. Put it in the ears of Joshua. It is something that the people of Israel must remember, that things are not complete as long as we have such negative forces that hate the Jewish people. Fight them, right? Fight their actions, and as we'll see soon, fight their philosophy. Okay? Amalek, event number one. Event number two described in the Torah right afterwards, no coincidence. The author obviously placed the story of Yitro joining the nation. In other words, as something incredible occurs with the Exodus, and Amalek's decision is, you know how I'm going to act? I'm going to attack, fight, uproot, destroy the Jewish people. Yitro decides to join. That's the next event. Event number three in this order is Kabbalat Torah. This incredible experience. Our ancestors actually experience a revelation. So how do we put the three together? What's the order of things, or what is being taught here by placing them in this specific order? So I'm going to read to you a midrash, a very old rabbinic source that tells us a little bit about Yitro. And the midrash tells us that you should know that when Yitro tells Moshe that now I know that Gadol Hashem Mikol Elokim. Now I know that God is the greatest. So the Midrash tells us, Lo heniach Yitro avodah zara bechol haolam. Yitro did not leave aside any pagan practice, any idolatry. Shelo chazar alea ve'avda. Yitro was an expert, a master avodah zara practicer. He tried everything. He studied all foreign philosophies, all pagan philosophies, all pagan practices, a true expert. And then he comes to Judaism, and he says, you know what? This is the truth. That's the journey of Yitro. So obviously this gives us tremendous insight into this parsha. You have a parsha that one half is about Yitro, one half is about the revelation at Sinai. And if you wonder what's the connection, well, the connection is Yitro is going through a journey of discovery. He's trying to figure out, why do we live? What are we here to achieve? What is life all about? So these are existential questions. So he starts seeking, and he does his research, and he travels the region. And interacts with all kinds of pagan cultures. He studies it, he rejects them, and he walks into Judaism. That's the Kabbalat Torah. Now, it's interesting that in rabbinic sources and among the commentators, some see Yitro, or some say that these events that are described occur after the Torah was given, and some say that it occurred before. And I see within it a little bit of two philosophical approaches to foreign wisdom. And let me tell you what exactly that means. There's a statement that was made in the Mishnah in Avot that a Jewish person should be educated, and you should be knowledgeable, ma shetashiv la'apikoros. In other words, you're interacting with apikoros, a term that we, the Jewish people, took from, the Greeks. There was actually a person called Epicurus. And we use it as a label of a heretic. So Judaism tells us, be knowledgeable, know how to respond. Now, the question is, if I want to take this statement very, very seriously, I decided I want to become knowledgeable because I want to know how to defend my tradition. What does that mean? So I'm going to give two approaches here. A, know my Judaism very well. Know every single law from the Talmud. Know all of Maimonides. Understand what the Jewish thinkers say. Understand halacha. And then if there's someone that comes to challenge me, I will have so much knowledge of Torah, I'm going to be able to defend my tradition. That's approach A. Approach B, know what they are saying. Understand pagan cultures. Understand Greek philosophy. Understand Western philosophy. Understand what is being discussed in departments of ethics in Harvard. Because if you know what they are thinking and process the questions that they might ask the Torah Jew, and then think through it and come up with a defense, if I go through all that processing, one day I will know Mashet Tashiv Lapikoris. So you see the difference between A and B? Approach A is only study Torah. Only study Torah. The idea of foreign knowledge or foreign research has absolutely no place after the Torah was given. Approach number two is that the idea of being familiar enough to know how to defend your tradition does have its place even after the Torah was given. So if I ask someone, should I take out a book on philosophy and become a little bit familiar with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and Aquinas? So if I approach someone with approach A to this statement, they'll say absolutely not. Bittul Torah, study Torah only. If I approach someone who read it with approach B, they would say, you know what? Perhaps there is a benefit because when you come familiar, you'll know how to defend your tradition. So I personally see that if some rabbis tell us that Yitro being mentioned or Yitro's journey is one that you should place before the Torah is given, it is as if we're being told all this idea of a person like Yitro who researched everything only has place before the Torah was given. If on the other hand, Yitro is someone that has a role after the Torah was given, if the events occurred afterwards, perhaps what's being hinted to us here is that even after the Torah was given, perhaps you could become familiar with other philosophies because you could walk away with an enhancement of your tradition to be able to one day defend it. I when I look again at that statement, Dama shetashiv la'apikores, so I argue that there are three things we're being told here: know how to reject, know how to answer, and know how to appreciate. Know how to reject, become knowledgeable to be able to reject foreign philosophy or foreign approaches. Know how to answer, know to appreciate. Now, what do I mean by reject, answer, and appreciate? So I'll say the following. When, let's say you're 3 centuries before the Common Era, what kind of foreign thought existed in that era, right? 2,500 years ago, 3,500 years ago. So what existed was avodah zarah, pagan practices, right? That you want to satisfy the gods. You got to go ahead and dance in a specific way, burn a specific thing, bring a specific offering. There, you need to know. The study of Torah teaches you know to reject. We completely reject avodah zarah. It has no room. Now, after the Common Era, with the development of these two big faiths, Christianity and Islam, it's a little bit different because Christianity and Islam, yes, we're extremely disturbed if, God forbid, a Jewish person starts practicing these things, but we don't view it as complete avodah zarah. So when you defend yourself from these philosophies, it is not so much to reject, but to answer. You're familiar with the work of the Kuzari. The work of the Kuzari is Rabbi Yehuda Halevi telling us that you could compare and contrast Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, And when you analyze it very well, you understand that everything good that they got, everything, the beautiful things that Christianity preaches. And if you read the Sermon on the Mount and you say, you know what, that fellow JC actually had some nice things to say, you know where he got every single one of them? From rabbinic sources. And when you go ahead and talk about what Islam talks about, commitment and prayer and anything that you do find in Islamic culture that you say, you know what, it is something I appreciate. Do you know where they got that from? From Judaism. So it's to know how to answer by understanding that anything good that these faiths have come from us. This is something that Rambam tells us, Rabbi Yehuda Levi. But then there's a third part, which I call it know how to appreciate. We've talked over the years a little bit about existentialism. That there was a great French thinker by the name of Jean-Paul Sartre, and Sartre believed that there's, earlier on in his life, that there is no God, and therefore we simply exist, and we have to figure out our essence after we exist. And he coined the term that existence precedes our essence. And obviously, as a Torah Jew, we know that we have an essence, a neshama that precedes our existence. Fine. So when you read about people like Nietzsche, and you read about people like Sartre, and you read about people about Camus that describe in magnificent terms the struggle of existence. Why live, right? If I don't believe in a God, and I don't believe in a neshama, and I'm wise enough to realize that I'm not going to be here forever, why exist at all? What is life about? And they use terms that it's a life of anguish, or it's an absurd life, or nihilism. There's no purpose in existence at all. And they are lost and forlorn, and they go meshuggah. And if you read the history of the great philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, he went meshuggah the last 11, 12 years of his life, because what's existence about? When you study Yiddishkeit, after knowing what they struggled, you appreciate what you have. It's comparable to someone that goes outdoors today and you walk outside, it's freezing, but you, Baruch Hashem, have a coat, and you interact with someone that doesn't have a coat. You appreciate your coat when you see someone without it. And when you study the existentialists, from Heidegger to Camus to Nietzsche, and obviously Sartre, you realize that they are outside in the cold without the coat. You appreciate Judaism. So the philosopher, Yitro is our philosopher. Yitro is our philosopher. And obviously we can understand how that leads to Torah. But the question I have is, okay, we've linked Yitro to Kabbalah Satorah. How does the Amalek part, the last section in last week's portion, which Rashi tells us that Yitro was familiar with it. So obviously these are not just events recorded in the Torah one after the other. These are events in sequence. One impacted the other. Amalek, Yitro, Kabbalat Torah. What are we being taught by the way the three of them are positioned? Okay, so that's the question I have. Now, the essence of fighting Amalek for us is not to go and try to chase or destroy a specific nation. You know that there's no mitzvah for us to start signing up to some website of ancestry and doing research into who is a descendant of Amalek and going ahead and blowing up their house. It's not what the Torah wants from us. So before Purim, or when you read the section about Amalek and the Torah tells us, remember this. What the Torah wants from us more than anything else is to remember their ideology and to uproot their ideology. There is something destructive in the ideology of Amalek. And it is one word that later on in the Torah, it is used to describe the attack, Asher karcha baderech, mikre. The rabbis tell us, the essence of this corrupt nation was that they viewed all existence as the byproduct of randomness. Everything is random. And the idea that there was a lottery done by a descendant of Amalek Haman. Everything is random, okay? If you have a philosophy and a belief that all of existence is the result of a mistake, and it's a random existence. And it happened to be that some species adapted and survived, and others did not. And we just evolved from some animals, and we're just more sophisticated animals, and we're nothing more than animals. And therefore, we might be very ethical by not eating them because we are descendants. But if you take the approach of randomness, the result will be Amalek. Now, how do I know that? There's a professor. His name is Richard Weikart, Weikart. And he wrote a book. He wrote a book that agitated many intellectuals. But sometimes when you write things and you prove it, it becomes a harsh reality for many. The name of his book was From Darwin to Hitler. From Darwin to Hitler. And what this Professor Weikart did was he studied great anti-Semitic thinkers and eventually policymakers of Germany of the late 19th, early 20th century, because Hitler did not just come out of nowhere. This was obviously a way of thinking that existed in Germany at the time. And he came to the conclusion that there is unfortunately a very strong link between a believer that existence is just the byproduct of a mistake and it's random, that the species that survive are the fittest, and if nature itself works in such a way that those who are more fit survive, well, it could apply to races as well. And the Aryan race was well viewed, or it is well documented that the German thinkers of that era believed that they are the supreme, the Ubermensches. And therefore, if nature itself rejects these lower races, why can't we just participate and be partners in getting rid of those lower races and getting rid of those with disabilities and getting rid of the infants that are not going to develop into ideal people and get rid of the Jews? And he documented thinker after thinker after thinker. This Weikart documented them. You could go to YouTube and read up on and hear and listen to lectures. There is a strong link between Darwinism and Hitler. We talked about existentialists and talk about Nietzsche, the great philosopher, the one that declared God is dead. What he was really saying is that there's this void that we have, that we don't have God, we have to make an Ubermensch. And his philosophy was taken over, or his legacy was taken over by his sister. His sister took over, he lost his mind in the last decade or so of his life. His sister became the spokesman, and she was an anti-Semite. And she became a Nazi, very active in the Nazi party at the end of her life, that linked Nietzsche to Nazism. Well, the relationship is, if you believe that you're supposed to make an Ubermensch, so Aryan race, that's how you make a super person. But for Richard Weikart, it is more Darwin that impacted and created Nazi Germany. And for a Torah Jew, this is not far-fetched at all. If you believe in mikre, if you believe that everything is a result of a mikre, it's random that this species did survive, this one did not. So you know what happens afterwards? You turn into an Amalek. You turn into a person that you're going to fight those who cry out to the world, no, it's not random. There's a creator. There's a purpose in existence. That we go through this life that might appear absurd, but it's not absurd. There's meaning because there's a creator, and we have a neshama, and there's something we're trying to achieve. The random philosophy leads to an Amalek that's going to try to uproot the Jewish people. That's what Weikart tells us. So Amalek is the problem. Amalek comes about because of randomness. But you know what? Not all humans are swept away by it. There are righteous Gentiles, right? Just as there is a Raoul Wallenberg, there's a Yitro. And Yitro, right, when he sees an attack against the Jewish people, and perhaps he always saw actions of humans that were extremely corrupt. According to Chazal, according to the rabbis, he was present when they made the decrees in Egypt to drown Jewish babies, he realized that there is such corruptness in the world. He realized that a human is obligated to seek, to start searching. What's existence about? And when the rabbis decide to share with us that Yitro spends his life trying to figure out all avodah zarah, it's not just curiosity. He's trying to discover the truth. And there's no question in my mind that anyone who studies, any decent human being, non-Jew, who studies about the Shoah and realizes how low a human being could sink, has an obligation to start asking questions about existence. If that could happen to a human being, what is life about? What is existence about? Questions should be asked, right? I remember sharing with you in the past that when I was in Memphis taking courses, so this goes back already like close to 15 years ago, there was a fellow called Carl Gupta. Carl Gupta was taking courses, and he was, I think by now he's a professor. And Gupta shared with me, so first he shares with me, you should know I'm a Gupta. I didn't know what that means, but then eventually explained to me that a Gupta, if you come from an Indian family, it's one of the Chosheva names, upper caste. I wanted to say to him, I'm a Gupta. He says, I'm a Malevsky, but he says to me, I'm a Gupta. So Carl Gupta told me at some point that he's in anguish, that because he's a Christian, and he knows that there's a direct relationship between the preaching of anti-Semitism by the church throughout the ages, that in some ways it led to the Shoah. So because he studied Shoah in depth, he was a brilliant fellow, he's unsettled. He's unsettled. He says, I take medications to deal with how cruel we've been towards the Jewish people. And at one point they said to him, you know what? You could always walk away from your faith if you really have a problem. It didn't work. But the point is that he had an understanding that when a Shoah occurs, it should stir every single human being, right? And you read about, historians will tell you that people like Eisenhower or Hitchcock were stirred when they saw what happened there. And the Torah expects every human to turn into a Yitro. Turn into a Yitro, that you start asking questions. Existence cannot be random because randomness leads to a Shoah. So there must be a purpose that is beyond logic. There must be some way to connect to something that is unseen. Yitro starts his journey, and when the rabbis tell us that he really put effort into understanding all the avodah zarah of the world, it is in no way to tell us that he did something negative. It was positive. He was seeking. He was searching. He had questions because an event occurred. So it's, again, in the Torah, it's presented as Amalek, but for Yitro, there are many others. But the way the Torah wants us to read it is the following. You believe in randomness, there'll be an Amalek. If there's an Amalek, there's an expectation from all human beings to start asking questions. Because if you don't ask, if you don't seek, if you don't start addressing it, there'll be another one, God forbid, right? And the world doesn't learn that there were a lot of tragedies of humanity because they don't start asking the question, why do we live? Now, asking the questions is good, but the answer should be Kabbalat Torah. The events at Sinai, the revelation, are not just relevant for the people of Israel, they are relevant for humanity. And if they appear in Pareshat Yitro, the parsha of the man, right, the spiritual seeker, if the Torah in this week's parsha talks about a revelation, what HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying, dear world, if you want to know about justice, if you want to know about ethics, rational thinking is good. You can make a contribution by thinking through things. Yes, the human mind has the ability to figure out what's considered ethical and not, but to an extent. Because if you don't believe in Kabbalat Torah, if you do not believe in the book that states that every single human being was created in the Spirit of God. In other words, why do we Jews, when we see someone going through difficulty, when we see a human being, we understand immediately that we have a responsibility because we see within them the divine. We see HaKadosh Baruch Hu in every single human being. And that is what guides us ethically. And the revelation and this message is relevant to humanity. And the journey of humanity has to be the Yitro journey. We expect everyone to seek. And if a human being seeks, we respect it. We respect it. I've interacted in the past with a Protestant minister. And, he told me straight out that he deeply feels that if he would have been around, he studied about the Shoah, and if he would have been around, he would have helped Jews even risk his life. And I believe that he meant it. And he was a seeker because he read about the Shoah. He read about what humans could do. He was a seeker, and he's a good person. He's a Yitro. But there's one step further that we're waiting for the day that the voices from Sinai will hit all of humanity. And according to the Rambam, by the way, the tremendous success of Islam and Christianity are due to the fact that they are preparing the world for the monotheism of Judaism. In other words, if the world would have been a pagan world, and one day this personality would come and start telling them about ethics and about one God and what he expects from humanity, it would be very foreign. But the truth is, Rambam writes, that when you look at these popular newer religions of the past 1600 years ago or 2000 years, Christianity and Islam, they're not so far from Judaism, okay? And therefore they can accept our teachings. And one day they're going to hear the voices from Sinai, because they're going to go ahead and complete the journey of Yitro. So these are messages that are very much important as we look at the world. We look at the world, right? And we as Jews have to talk about the idea that nothing is random. Existence has reason. And when you understand that there's a reason, you could deal with challenge better, right? We've been going through yucky 22 months already, right? From March 2020. Uncertainty, being driven crazy. And if you think everything is random, this is not an easy time. If you think everything comes from above, it's also not an easy time. But we're given tools to deal with them. That there's chesed that you could do. There's the study of Torah that perhaps you can increase. You could daven at home. There are things you could do that you still find meaning, because we reject randomness. We reject the belief that everything just happens on its own. And even though HaKadosh Baruch Hu worked out a system and created a system that makes it appear as if everything occurs on its own, it's not the way things are really. HaKadosh Baruch Hu created that system because he wants to give us a choice and free will. And the way we have free will is by the Creator concealing himself. So this is all here for us. And when we make those right decisions and we live with purpose, we could deal with challenges. We could accept them, right? And we'll have our ups and our downs, right? Sometimes we do feel the absurdity of existence. And sometimes we feel that we're in anguish and we have difficulty of making choices. We feel like we're in an existential struggle. But at the end of the day, we have something to turn to. We have something to turn to, which is our tefillah, our belief, our appreciation to what we have. There's so many good things we could do. So this is the journey of the people of Israel. So hopefully we gain something from this very significant parsha. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank our sponsors again.